federalism. What is federalism? If you've lived in a federal country, the United States is a federal country, what did you imagine of the government? When I ask students to draw the structure of the United States government, many of them tend to believe that there is the national government. You have the Congress, the president, you have the judiciary, right? And then underneath them you have states and their governors, right? Who do what the national government tells them, and then you have the local government. But in fact, there's a reason why this confusion happens, and we'll talk about that today. So, this is a centralized or unitary system. Really looks like this, right? A federal system is a little bit different. In a federal system, you have a sharing of power between the national government, in America call it the federal government, and regional or constituent governments, which we call state governments. And it's that power relationship between the two that we refer to as federalism. Okay? Now, when the founding fathers had finished the construction of the new system, Benjamin Franklin, for example, was asked by a lady, "What form of government have you created?" And he said, "A republic if we can keep it." And so it's true. Republics require the people to understand what form of government they are under. Federal systems require the people to understand what form of government they're under. Otherwise, they may be willing to surrender and to morph their systems and find themselves in centralized, unitary systems. Now, federal systems tend to have exhibit checks and balances, right? The courts play a major role in this type of systems, right? Now, we'll talk about checks and balances later. Constitutions can be written or unwritten, right? Most right now in the world, if not all, are written constitutions, a document that's written down. Now, constitutions can also be flexible or rigid. State constitutions tend to be rigid, while the national constitution tends to be more flexible. Rigid means it's very worded, has many volumes. It leaves very little room for interpretation by a judge, right? Famously, I like to say one legal clause, one proposal that was given in Texas and became part of the Constitution was to give rodeo cowboys and rodeo cowgirls the right to have raffle tickets during rodeo events. Now, why would you have such a thing in the Constitution? Well, in places like Texas, we don't want anybody to guess what we're trying to say. We don't want to give the judge too much room for interpretation, right? Now, when you go to the national constitution, if you go to the Texas Constitution, it has hundreds of what we call amendments, right? So an article is what is original in a legal document. Therefore, we have 7 articles in the national constitution, while we have 27 amendments done to the original document. That's why we call the Bill of Rights the first 10 amendments. All right? So, if you take states that are very rigid, like Texas, we have hundreds of amendments, right? And so, that's a rigid constitution. While the national constitution, which is 100 years younger than Texas's constitution, has only 27 amendments. For example, the Second Amendment, what does it say? Most people say the right to keep and bear arms, right? Well, it's a sentence. It's only one sentence. It says, a well-regulated militia, being necessary for a free state, the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So what is the subject? Is it the maintenance of a free state? Therefore, states are supposed to be in charge of the Second Amendment, and that's the only purpose by why it was written. Is it the creation of well-regulated militias? Well, who regulates the militia? Well, historically the state and the federal government, because the president is the commander-in-chief of the army, the navy, and the civil militias of the states according to the Constitution. So it is the federal government that's in charge, and it's just about creating regulated militias like the National Guard and the police and state troopers? Or is it about the individual rights to keep weapons and all forms of weapons in America and shall not be infringed? How do we interpret that? So you can see how Supreme Court judges over time are interpreting the Second Amendment in different ways, right? Until current, where we are mostly focused on the individual, not on the state or the federal governments, right? So that's just an example of a flexible constitution, and therefore the national government is flexible because it is not so worded, it allows room for debate and discussions. And really the question is, what did the founding fathers really mean and intend when they created these amendments like the Second Amendment? Now, as I said, a federal system, from the Latin fideus, the relationship between God in the universe, man ruling the earth, the relationship between a national government and the state governments, a balancing of power rather than one being superior to the other, and each one encompassing their own unique powers, right? And power is distributed across the whole system and shared across the whole system. There are many safeguards like the judiciary that play part in this across a federal system. Now, the powers of the national government versus the powers of the state government. The powers of the national government are called the delegated powers or the enumerated powers because they have been enumerated or stated in the national constitution. That's how we know what the national government can do. We read Article 1 to know what the legislative branch is in charge of. Article 2 to know what the executive branch is in charge of. Article 3 to know what the judicial branch is in charge of. That's how we know what powers each and how the structures of each of the branches of government look like. They are expressed in the Constitution. They're implied. For example, the federal government is in charge of commerce and finance of the nation. Therefore, it could be implied that they can create national banks or Federal Reserve banks to manage the monetary policy, the money, the banks, the interest rates, right? It's also inherent that as a government, it should be assumed that you are in charge of security, amongst many other things. Now, how therefore do we know the powers of the state? According to the 10th Amendment, any power not given or delegated to the national government, nor prohibited to the state governments, is the power of the states and the people thereof. That's why we call it the reserved powers. Therefore, the Constitution is not so worded, as I said. All the articles, the 7 articles, they're mostly focused on the structures of the national government. The amendments are mostly focused on individual rights and liberties. And then they focus on suffrage and justice, okay? So they don't go into too many areas. They don't talk about health, marriage, abortion. All these things are not specifically or explicitly written in the Constitution, although some would argue may be inferred in the Constitution. And so, because a lot of issue areas are not written down, we call those reserved powers. Therefore, the states have the power over those issue areas. Okay? Now, I've already talked to you about that balance. You have the confederal system where power is more with the states and the national government is the organ of the national government works for the states. Federalism, we're trying to balance the relationship between the two. We have something called symmetric versus asymmetric federalism, where some states may have more power in some countries than others, while in the United States it's symmetric. All states are supposed to be equal. And then unitary means everything is centralized, the national government is really in charge, and the rest of the states, and actually majority of the countries in the world, are unitary rather than federal. So what causes the confusion between which government is in charge of doing what? Why will it be difficult for an American to actually know or which government is in charge? We have the Department of Education at the national level, Department of Health. We have Department of Education at the state level, Department of Health. It seems as if the national government is the one actually in charge and the state governments are actually working for the national government. Now, it's argued around 1940s with the New Deal era under FDR is where things became quite difficult to separate the two levels of government, or the two, So, we have dual federalism, also called layer cake federalism, and then we have marble cake federalism. Assuming you've had cake and you've not been allergic, a layer cake is one that you can see where the chocolate is and where the vanilla is. You can tell where the chocolate is and the strawberry is. You can tell it's a layer of cake. You can tell the difference between reserved powers and delegated or enumerated powers, right? So at the beginning of the nation, it's very clear where the states have power reserved to them and where powers were given in the national constitution and delegated to the national government. So it's very clear, we can tell the difference, okay? Now there are some powers that are concurrent. That means both governments have power. Whether you're talking about both levels of government can tax, they can have law enforcement at the national level and local level or state level, amongst many other things like that, okay? So, but there was clear distinction between the two levels. Now, when the distinction becomes blurry, where we cannot tell the jurisdictional lines of power, we are entering into the world of a marbled cake. Now, I normally ask students who has never eaten a marbled cake, and for that one person who's never eaten marbled cake, find a friend, tell them to take you to Kroger and buy a marbled cake and taste it. It means a swirl. The chocolate and the vanilla are swirled all around. We cannot tell who has power to do what. We cannot tell where reserved powers begin. We cannot tell. So things become muddy. And the question is, what are some factors that cause marbling in the United States and in other systems? Well, one of the things is called grants in aid, right? So, for example, states take money from the federal government for educational purposes. Now, the states are in charge of education. But the federal government says, if you touch this money, you must provide free lunch. If you touch this money, every student must be present in class from K through 12. So now the federal government is speaking into areas of education that they actually are not in charge. For example, recently we saw the administration pressure schools by saying they will pull funding for research if schools do not enact certain protocols when it comes to student protest. So you can see how the federal government can step into areas that they don't have power by giving funding or helping in some way, okay? So that's one way in which we become confused, because we are seeing the national government talk on help, on education, because why? They're giving funding to states or incentives to states if they follow certain national guidelines, even though it's not the reserved powers of the state. But it doesn't end there, because you have, for example, amendments over time. So states are in charge of elections, but you pass the 15th Amendment and states no longer have the power to stop all men in America from voting. You have the 19th Amendment, and now you cannot stop any sex from voting, so women can vote and participate in political life. So as amendments are happening, states are still in charge of elections, but they cannot discriminate on elections. You have states are still in charge of labor, but to the extent that they don't discriminate. According to the 13th Amendment, they cannot have slavery as part of their labor. So you have amendments that are happening over time, and while states still have reserved powers, those powers have been mitigated by national law, which is supreme according to Article 6 of the Supremacy Clause. Okay, so you have judicial decisions, right? In the 70s, the court passes Roe v. Wade, and because, again, national law, congressional law, that's Congress, judicial decisions by the Supreme Court and federal courts, and amendments to the Constitution, all these things begin to change or alter what the states can do, even in areas that they have reserved powers. Okay? And I think you understand the gist now, all right? So that's what is the difference between cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism and what causes marbling. But what is very important to understand is that's why it becomes difficult for us to know which government is in charge of doing what. Because now the federal government can touch areas of reserved powers, right? The state has the power to do 1, 2, 3. But because the national government says, even though you have the power to do 1, 2, 3, you cannot discriminate while doing that. Now, the federal government can step in whenever a state discriminates in a particular area, right? So you have that. The other thing to talk about is devolution versus centralization. Now, devolution doesn't completely lead you to federalism, but if you think about a unitary state or when power becomes centralized, over time people argue that some federal systems become centralized. A lot of power is flowing to the national government over time than at the very beginning. That's centralization. Now, permeation of power is when power moves away from the central to regional governments. That's part of devolution, where power is moving from a centralized unitary system to the constituent parts. Okay? So, as I've said, the powers of federal government are expressed, delegated powers, like Article 1, Section 8 says, the federal government has the power to do whatever is proper and necessary for the execution of the foregoing powers vested and all other powers vested in the Constitution. So this means that the federal government, for example, can say, we believe it's proper and necessary to have a space force. We believe it's proper and necessary to have a Federal Reserve Bank. Now, that may not be written in the Constitution, but it's proper and necessary for the foregoing and the execution of the powers vested in the Constitution. Now, if a state feels that the federal government does not have that power, therefore the state can take the federal government to court, a federal court, and argue otherwise, right? And so that's the idea that there are powers that are implied for the federal government. Now, for the state governments, their powers are reserved, right? According to the 10th Amendment, as I said, any powers not given or delegated to the federal government, nor prohibited from the state governments, are the powers of the states and the people thereof, right? Now, as far as elections, it's clear that in Article 1, Section 4 says the states determine the times, manner, and places of holding elections within the states. So voting in California will not be the same as voting in Florida, nor Texas, no other place, okay? So the states determine how voting is in the particular states. Article 2, Section 2 says states appoint according to the number of representatives and senators, number of electors who choose the president, right, or select the president. So even the electoral college is chosen by the states. So states are very powerful as far as the process of electioneering. But there are certain powers that are concurrent, shared between both governments. Whether you're talking about taxing, highways, roadworks, all right, policing, all these are powers that both levels of government execute at the same time or can choose to execute at the same time. Now, going back, remember the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. That the Constitution of the United States, federal laws and federal judgments are superior to state laws and superior judgments. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be in pursuance thereof, and all treaties. Treaties are agreements between the United States and another country, right? Once those treaties are signed, they are ratified in the Senate by 2/3 majority, and they become the laws of the land, right? And so anything that is made, the laws, the Constitution, the treaties, are the supreme law of the land. And therefore, every judge, every legislature, right, or any state constitution is bound thereby, right? And so even if a state like Texas, we say you have to be 21 to vote. Once the 26th Amendment is passed in the national constitution, every 18-year-old in the country can vote. All right? And so that's the relationship. That's how we understand how the power dynamics works as far as law is concerned. Okay? So when the national government passes a law, right? In the 1970s, the courts passed Roe v. Wade. Recently, the courts passed a new law, and therefore the law system shifts, right? So that's how power works in a federal system. Now, advantages of being in a federal country. Now, why not be in a unitary system where power is concentrated in the center? Well, you can get things done faster if you're in such countries like China, right? You can move things with the Chinese speed, right? Because there's not too many things stopping the national government from enacting and doing what it wants. Versus a federal system where you have power at the center, maybe the capital city, but in the federal system, you have every regional state, every state has its own power. It has its own capital. It has its own governor. And so power is spread in this system, right? So power is devolved. And one of the things I normally say is when you go to countries that are very unitary, the further away you are from power or their capital cities, the less you feel government. There's less healthcare. The roads are not good, right? And so you really feel the difference, right, when you're far away from power. Versus if you're in a federal system, you still feel there's some government close to you, right? There's greater government response to your issues. And so I'll normally say of the United States, which is light years away from most countries in the world, that even if you move away from the city, you still have access to healthcare, roads, bridges. You still have access to adequate some level of internet. And while there's relative difference within the country, overall, you feel the government. While as in this type of system out here, you can have rebel groups, right? You can have nomads, because there's really no government or support out there. All right. So power is devolved in this system. There are greater checks and balances, as I said. If the federal government goes out of line, states can check the federal government, right? And so that balancing of power, the fact that everybody feels inclusion, right? The sense that even if the main government is run by one party, the different party can be running another state. There's a sense that everybody's included in the national pie. And therefore that reduces intensity and pressure and causes stability across the system. We see that in India, where you can have conflicts in some corners, or Nigeria, right? According to Federalist Paper 10, that's one of the geniuses of a federal system, is the ability to hold conflict and chaos within its single parts, within its states, okay? Rather than all the pressure comes down to the center. Think of countries that had very strong leaders, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Iraq. They all toppled once the pressure came to the center, right? So when all the power and the resources and everything is concentrated in the center under one government, it's easy to topple that government. Versus if you're trying to topple a country like the United States, you'll have to take out Washington, D.C. You'll have therefore go to 50 states and try to take out their national guards and their governors. It's quite difficult, all right? And so inclusion is important. Grievances are addressed faster because government is closer to the people. There's greater flexibility and adaptability, right? If there are wildfires in California, the government can deal with those issues better. In Texas, if they have drought. In Florida, if they have hurricanes. In the Midwest, whether they have all types of tornadoes. So even a country like the United States goes through so many natural events, yet unlike other places in the world where they go through one event and thousands of people die, in this country, because each state can better adapt to their environment, and we see there's better response, better flexibility. Power can, resources can move from the national government to assist states. And so this keeps the system very stable. Can explain why America has had such endurance in this system from 1787 to current times. One of the geniuses was how federal system works. And the judiciary acts as an empire. When states have disputes, they can go to court. When the states and national government have disputes, they can go to court. If one of the three branches has an issue with the other, so you can see how the courts act as an empire to reduce conflict, and stability endures and development endures, right? That's why we are seeing more countries in the world like Kenya, etc. They are moving from centralized unit to devolution. Power is moving to the different regions so that development can occur, right? So we've seen that happen in Kenya, I believe a little bit of Somalia, right? And we're seeing new states even in India to further increase their federal, increase the number of states. We're seeing power permeate in United Kingdom to other parts and their legislatures. So we can see this happening because the system is quite good and quite rigid in reducing pressure, reducing strife, etc. Now, let's look at some court cases on maybe how the judiciary handles these issues of power dynamics. So, in Maryland versus McCulloch, Maryland sues the administration because the national government in 1818 is creating national banks. The government says, according to Article 1.8, it's proper and necessary for us to create national banks in order to manage the monetary policy of the country, in terms of money, banks, etc. And so, the federal government argues they should be able to charter national banks. The court agrees. It says it's proper and necessary that a national government should be able to create national banks so they can stabilize the monetary system of that country. U.S. versus Lopez. The federal government tries to say that according to the Commerce Clause, which says the federal government is in charge of commerce between states, right? Selling goods and services across states, that they regulate, and they also regulate things living and entering the country, right? They say, therefore, they should be able to regulate guns because guns cross from one state to another. In this case, the national government loses because the courts don't believe guns meet the criteria of the commerce part of the national government's mandate. Arizona versus the U.S. Arizona wants to enact its own immigration law. They want to deal with the border issues themselves, right? Recently, Texas tried to do that. Well, in this case, you can understand why it will be a very bad idea for states to manage their own borders. What if one state closes their border to another state? What if one state opens their border, an international border, and allows everybody in while another one closes it? You can see it will cause a lot of dysfunction within a system and affect every single state as a whole. In this case, Arizona loses and states are not allowed to manage their own immigration policies. Florida versus the U.S. Department of Health. This was the Obamacare that we still have, or where there was an individual mandate, which was a type of fee that you had to pay or tax that you had to pay if you did not have healthcare insurance, and it was argued that it was legal to do so. Well, later we see the Trump administration to remove it, but it was enacted that Congress could do that, and then, or rather the national government could do that. Then U.S. versus Reich, which is who's in charge of marijuana. Is marijuana exclusively grown in states as part of agriculture, therefore the states regulate marijuana, or is marijuana something that is national, therefore the national government is in charge of marijuana? In this case, the national government wins by saying marijuana as a drug is something that permeates across states and it's a national issue, therefore the national government should be in charge of regulating marijuana, which is the case. The national government won, but we've seen the national government over time relinquish that control and allow states to make decisions on how they want to manage the use of marijuana in its various forms in their own states. All right? So those are some laws that came to the courts, and so you can see that relationship between the national government and state governments asking where are reserved powers, where are enumerated powers, right? And where can the national government touch and where can state governments touch, okay? And that is federalism and the type of system that we have.